You're sitting alone in a cold VA hospital waiting room, the clock ticking past noon, when an 88-year-old woman with a faded army jacket and a bronze star pinned to her chest is ignored by everyone around her. She doesn't protest, just sits quietly, her trembling hands clutching a letter sealed with red wax. To the busy nurses and impatient patients, she's just another forgotten old soul. But what they don't know, what no one suspects, is that this silent veteran once saved lives under fire in Normandy, and that letter now tucked away is about to ignite a firestorm that will shake the nation. The question is, who will answer her call, and what secrets will it unleash? It was a crisp November morning in Chicago, Illinois, the kind of day where the air bites at your cheeks and the fallen leaves crunch underfoot like whispered memories of autumns past. The year was 2024, and the city was waking up slowly, its streets bathed in the pale gray light of dawn. At the edge of downtown, near the hum of Lakeshore Drive, stood the VA hospital, a towering building of concrete and glass, its sign glowing faintly against the overcast sky. Inside, a woman sat alone in the waiting area, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the tiled floor. Her name was Eleanor Harper Ellie, to those who knew her best. She was 88 years old, a veteran of the Second World War, a nurse who had seen the horrors of battle and lived to tell the tale. But today, she felt invisible. Ellie sat on a hard plastic chair, the kind that creaks under even the slightest movement. She wore her old army jacket, a faded olive green, its fabric worn thin at the elbows but still proudly bearing the insignia of her service. Pinned to her chest was a bronze star, its ribbon frayed, but its meaning undimmed, a reminder of the lives she had saved under fire in Normandy all those years ago. Her silver hair was tied back in a neat bun, and her hands, though trembling slightly with age, were steady in their resolve. She had come to the VA hospital for a routine checkup. Her lungs had been troubling her lately, a lingering effect of the chemical fumes she had breathed in the war. But she had been waiting for hours. Her appointment time long past, and no one seemed to care. The waiting room was a sterile place, all white walls and fluorescent lights that buzzed softly overhead. The air smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, a scent that brought Ellie back to the field hospitals of 1944. Except back then, there had been the chaos of war, the shouts of medics, the groans of the wounded. Here there was only silence, broken occasionally by the shuffle of papers or the distant ring of a phone. Ellie glanced around, her sharp blue eyes taking in the other patients. There was a younger man, a veteran of a more recent war, his face etched with impatience as he scrolled through his phone. There were a few others scattered across the room, their heads bowed, their expressions weary. But no one looked at Ellie. No one saw her. She shifted in her seat, her back aching from the long wait. A nurse, a young woman named Jenny, her badge read, hurried past her arms full of files. Ellie raised a hand, her voice soft but firm. "Excuse me, miss. I've been waiting for my appointment. It was at 9 o'clock. Jenny barely glanced at her, her tone clipped and distracted. "We're running behind, ma'am. You'll have to wait a bit longer. We're very busy today." And with that she was gone, disappearing down the hall without a second thought. Ellie's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. She wasn't one to make a fuss. She had survived the war, after all, survived the bombs, the blood, the endless nights of fear. She could survive a few more minutes in a waiting room. But as the minutes turned into another hour, the weight of her solitude pressed down on her. She felt a pang in her chest, not from her lungs this time, but from something deeper, a sense of being forgotten, of being cast aside by the very country she had fought for. She reached up to touch the bronze star on her jacket, her fingers tracing its familiar shape. She remembered the day she had earned it, the day she had dragged a wounded soldier to safety under a hail of bullets, her heart pounding, her hands slick with blood. She had been 20 years old then, full of fire and purpose. Now, at 88, she wondered if anyone even cared. The waiting room door swung open, and a younger veteran walked in, a man named Mark with a military buzz cut and a prosthetic leg that clicked softly as he moved. He approached the desk, and Jenny the nurse greeted him with a smile. "Right this way, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice suddenly warm. "We've got a spot for you now." Ellie watched as Mark was ushered through the door, his appointment honored while hers was ignored. A bitter thought crossed her mind. They see me as just an old woman, not a soldier. Not a hero. The thought stung, but Ellie pushed it aside. She had learned long ago to keep her emotions in check, to focus on what needed to be done. As the clock on the wall ticked past noon, Ellie reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook and a pen. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the notebook, its pages yellowed with age. She began to write her script, careful and deliberate, the way she had written letters home during the war. She addressed the letter to an old friend, someone she hadn't seen in decades, but whose memory still brought her comfort. "Dear James," she wrote, "I hope this letter finds you well. I'm writing to you from the VA hospital in Chicago, where I've been waiting for hours to be seen. I don't mean to complain, but I can't help but feel that we've been forgotten, those of us who gave so much, who sacrificed our youth for this country. I think of the boys I saved in Normandy, the ones who never made it home, and I wonder if their sacrifice means anything anymore. I don't know if you'll read this, James, but I needed to write it. I needed to believe that someone still cares." Ellie paused, her pen hovering over the page. She thought of James Carter, the young lieutenant she had pulled from the wreckage of a bombed-out trench in 1944. He had been barely conscious, his leg torn open by shrapnel, but she had carried him to safety, her arms burning with the effort. He had survived thanks to her, and they had kept in touch for a while after the war. But life had pulled them apart, and she hadn't heard from him in years. She didn't even know if he was still alive. But writing to him felt right, like a lifeline to the past, a reminder of who she had been. She finished the letter with a simple closing, "Yours in service, Eleanor Harper." Then she folded the paper, carefully tucking it into an envelope she had brought with her. She sealed it with a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against the red wax seal she had pressed onto the flap. It was an old habit, one she had picked up during the war, when every letter felt like a sacred act. She slipped the envelope into her bag, her heart a little lighter, though her lungs still ached with every breath. She stood slowly, her knees protesting, and made her way to the exit. She would mail the letter on her way home. It was a small act of defiance, a quiet refusal to be invisible. The next few days passed in a blur of routine. Ellie returned to her small apartment on the south side of Chicago, a modest place filled with the relics of her past, faded photographs of her unit, a framed letter of commendation from her commanding officer, a worn copy of Stars and Stripes from VE Day. She spent her mornings reading, her afternoons writing letters to no one in particular, and her evenings listening to the radio, the crackle of old broadcasts filling the silence of her home. But her health was worsening. The cough that had plagued her for months grew sharper, more persistent, and she knew she needed to see a doctor soon. Yet the memory of her experience at the VA hospital kept her away. She couldn't bear the thought of being ignored again. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., a letter arrived at the office of Thupper Senator James Carter. James was 85 years old now, a tall man with a shock of white hair and a voice that still carried the authority of his military days. He had served in the Senate for nearly 3 decades, a champion of veterans' rights, though he often felt the weight of his own limitations. That morning, as he sorted through his mail, he came across an envelope with a red wax seal, a detail that stopped him cold. He recognized that seal. He tore open the envelope, his hands trembling not with age but with memory, and began to read. "Dear James." The letter began, and with those words he was transported back to 1944, to a muddy trench in Normandy, to the sound of bombs and the smell of smoke, to the arms of a young nurse who had saved his life. Eleanor Harper, Ellie. He hadn't thought of her in years, not because he had forgotten her, but because the memory was too painful, too raw. She had been his guardian angel, a woman of quiet courage who had carried him to safety when he was sure he would die. And now, here she was writing to him from a VA hospital, her words filled with a quiet despair that broke his heart. James read the letter twice, then a third time, his eyes misting over. "I don't mean to complain," she wrote, "but I can't help but feel that we've been forgotten." He thought of all the veterans he had met over the years, the ones who had slipped through the cracks of a broken system, the ones who had given everything only to be met with indifference. He thought of Ellie waiting in that cold hospital, her service unrecognized, her pain ignored. And he knew he had to do something. That afternoon, James took the letter to the Senate floor. He stood at the podium, his voice steady but thick with emotion, and began to speak. "Colleagues," he said, "I hold in my hand a letter from a woman who saved my life in 1944. Her name is Eleanor Harper, and she is 88 years old. She is a hero, a recipient of the Bronze Star, a nurse who risked everything to save the lives of soldiers like me. And yet, just a few days ago, she sat in a VA hospital in Chicago, waiting for hours to be seen ignored by the very system she fought for. This is her story, and it is the story of too many of our veterans. We cannot let their sacrifices be forgotten. We cannot let them be invisible." He read Ellie's letter aloud, his voice breaking on the final line, "I needed to believe that someone still cares." The chamber was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. And then slowly the applause began, a thunderous wave that echoed through the halls of Congress. Within hours, Ellie's story was everywhere. News outlets picked it up, headlines blaring, "88-year-old veteran's letter exposes VA failures." Social media buzzed with outrage and admiration. And in Chicago, Ellie's quiet life was about to change forever. It was a Tuesday morning when the knock came at Ellie's door. She was sitting in her armchair, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, when she heard it, a sharp, insistent rap that startled her out of her thoughts. She stood slowly, her cane tapping against the floor, and opened the door to find a young woman standing there, a microphone in hand and a camera crew behind her. "Mrs. Harper," the woman asked, her voice bright with excitement. "I'm Sarah Bennett with Channel 5 News. We'd like to talk to you about your letter." Ellie blinked, her mind racing. "My letter?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her eyes shining. "Yes, ma'am. Your letter to Senator James Carter. It's gone viral. The whole country is talking about it. They're calling you a hero." Ellie felt her knees weaken, and she gripped the doorframe for support. She had never expected this, never imagined that her words written in a moment of quiet despair would reach so far. "Come in," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I'll put on some tea." Over the next hour, Sarah and her crew filled Ellie's small apartment with light and sound, their cameras capturing every detail. The framed commendation on the wall, the faded photographs of her unit, the Bronze Star pinned to her jacket. Ellie spoke haltingly, at first, her voice soft but steady, as she told them about her time in the war, about the boys she had saved, about the long wait at the VA hospital. "I didn't write that letter to cause trouble," she said, her hands folded in her lap. "I just wanted someone to listen." Sarah listened, her eyes wide with admiration. "Mrs. Harper," she said, "your letter didn't just get someone to listen, it got the whole nation to listen." Senator Carter read it on the Senate floor. "The VA has issued a public apology, and they're promising reforms. You've started a movement." Ellie stared at her, her heart pounding. "A movement," she whispered. Sarah nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Because of you, veterans across the country are speaking up. You've given them a voice." In the weeks that followed, Ellie's life became a whirlwind. The VA hospital in Chicago invited her to a formal ceremony where the director personally apologized and announced new measures to ensure better care for elderly veterans. A crowd of hundreds gathered outside the hospital, their applause ringing in Ellie's ears as she stepped onto the stage, her army jacket pressed and her Bronze Star gleaming. She spoke to them, her voice stronger than it had been in years, telling the story of a young nurse in Normandy who had refused to give up even when the world seemed to be falling apart. "I never thought I'd see a day like this," she said, her eyes shining with tears. "Thank you for remembering us." Letters began to arrive at Ellie's apartment, hundreds, then thousands, from veterans and civilians alike. They thanked her for her courage, for her service, for reminding them of the debt they owed to those who had fought for their freedom. One letter, written in a child's careful hand, stood out above the rest. "Dear Mrs. Harper," it read, "my name is Emily, and I'm 10 years old. My grandpa was a soldier, and he told me stories about the war. I think you're a hero. Thank you for being so brave." Ellie held the letter to her chest, her heart swelling with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. This is the story of a nurse and a nation of a cold morning at a VA hospital, of a letter sealed with red wax that bridged the gap between forgotten sacrifice and remembered honor. It's a reminder that for heroes like Ellie Harper, who once carried the wounded through the fires of Normandy, the greatest tribute we can offer is to ensure their voices are heard, their sacrifices never fade. So take a moment today. Think of Ellie of James, of the countless veterans whose stories still wait to be told. Share this story, not just to honor them, but to remind us all that justice and compassion are the truest ways to repay their duty. And if you're ever in Chicago, pause by the VA hospital, look at the faces passing by, and listen. You might just hear the echo of a bronze star beating strong through the years.